African humanism is the basis for African communalism. And this is tied to consumer cooperatives or any kind of cooperative economics. Communalism is the economic philosophy of Africa. And by the way, if the bourgeoisie that's so bankrupt had really internalized communalism, they would have made quite a contribution to the race. In fact, DuBois, one of the reasons he became so disappointed in the Black middle class is at one point he thought the talented 10th would lead the race. Then he came to the conclusion that they didn't have an interest in anything other than their own material well-being. He said he had thought that this group would take on the communal ethos, because in the United States, the definition of communalism is that the land, air, and water is owned by no one, but is shared by all. So in the United States, where private property prevailed, making you property, then, it's impossible for you to just go on and share somebody's land without owning it. But the fact is, the communal ethos carried us through, the sharing ethos, that whatever we had, that came from the humanistic base of our being, that's what carried us through. And so in Africa, communalism was prevalent throughout Africa and still is in the villages in Africa. And because the land, air, and water was owned by no person, including the king, if you had one, and everyone had a right to share in that, they had to put in the work to benefit from it. Therefore, there was no widespread poverty, no homelessness, hunger, unless there was some kind of famine or something, or unemployment. So the ethos, again, of the African, when it came to communalism, was that as you use the land, air, and water, you should leave it in better condition for the next generation than it was in when you received it. And so built into that is this environmental thing that now is such a big deal after the planet is almost knocked out. It was built into the Africans' relationship to the land, to the air, to the water, to nature in general. So if a person wanted to build a house, there were no banks to go to, no mortgage you had to pay for. People worked in collective work teams and put together a house in very short order. Again, communalism. The family took care of their elders, communalism, And the African American still has that impulse. We do more to care for our people than any group probably other than Native Americans in this country. And you're going to see again how this figures into economic organization. If you're talking about consumer cooperatives, some of the things you got to do to draw on that and building a effective business in our community. And some of our people are doing it. We have consumer cooperatives around the country. I'm just offering some ideas on that. So the African and African American political, cultural, and social philosophy has to be centered on humanism and communalism, because these are principles that, when applied to economic organization, enables us to be able to put food on a person's table, a roof over their head, a job, and money in their pockets, and take them out of just being consumers into being producers. So let's look at how this can work based on the conditions of our people today. Today, with deindustrialization, you've had the weakening of the Black family from 75% two-parent households to 29% now. You need good-paying jobs to rebuild families. This is key. And one way is through business development. The job development is another I'm not focusing on today. So we need economic strategies that draw on these humanistic, communal, sharing impulses that come out of our culture. Now, W.B. Du Bois wrote an important book. All of his books were important. A book called Dusk of Dawn. It was written in the 30s in the midst of the Depression. This was after the Garvey movement has pretty well been, removed from the scenes. You still had remnants of it, but it no longer had the strength that it had in the 20s. And he's now revisiting his thinking on a lot of things. And I think he was impressed, even though Garvey and him were opponents. He was impressed by Garvey's economic organization. And while Garvey wasn't doing consumer cooperatives, he was doing business development, financed by Blacks. And so Du Bois observed some things that are very important that I think are still true today when it comes to economic organization. In the 1930s, in this book, Dusk of Dawn, he observed that, and this is key, quoting him, "The Black consumer had the decisive voice in industry rather than the all-powerful producer of the past." In other words, Blacks were consumers, and their power in the economy is tied to that fact. That is still the case, even more so today. So when he talked about the Black worker, he said that often the Black worker, as a producer, was an employer for whites. And a lot of those jobs are gone, those producing jobs. But even when they were there, while they were better paying, we weren't running those jobs. So what Du Bois proposed was economic salvation of Blacks along the lines of consumer cooperatives. His reasoning was that the social institutions of the Black community, particularly Black families, were made up almost entirely of consumers. And so therefore, we should build businesses based on that. Now, let's get something straight here, because cooperatives, I think, is the best way to go, because cooperatives allow people to put something in, some little money, whatever, and then get something out and to benefit from their labor proportionate to what they put in and the labor they put in as well, in those cases where they do. But I'm not putting down people who don't have consumer cooperatives, because a lot of Blacks, the overwhelming, something like 98% of Black businesses are owned by one person. And we need to get out of that. And over 40% of our businesses have been lost through COVID, because we didn't get the loans that a lot of other groups did. A lot of businesses have gone down, not just Black, but Blacks, 40%. It was the same thing in 2008. We lost over 40% of home ownership. And your Black president didn't do what he could have done to rescue homeowners. He had money that he didn't use and should have directed more towards it, but he saved the corporations, So when we're looking at it, Blacks have taken a heavy hit, and some Blacks are surviving basically on their own resources. They got a business employing one person, but that one person, it's feeding his family or her family or both of their families, or contributing to it. Or some people, they've got a job and they've got a business, So I'm not putting down these other businesses. I'm simply saying that this is a good way to go when it's coming to rebuilding our communities.